All right. Good evening, everyone. Let's try it again. Good evening, everyone. Excellent. And welcome back to class, our course on, well, a short course on Palestine with Professor Rashid Khalidi. Are we excited to be here? Excellent. So today is our third session where we'll touch on the 1967 war, the 1982 war, and why these are critical points in which the United States steps in and becomes a big player. I know this is many people's first time in class, so if it is yours, welcome. If you haven't registered yet, please be sure to do so you can get access to all the course recordings, all the reading materials, and any additional resources. Like we said, each class is recorded and you can access them at the same link that we use for the live stream. So I know we're super excited and we have lots of history to talk about. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor Khalidi.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. It's so gratifying to see so many people interested in Palestine and Palestinian history. I promise you 10 years ago this could not have happened. 5 years ago it might not have happened, but this is good. No, we're applauding the change, right? Okay. My focus this week, for this week's talk, is going to be on two wars that did much to define the modern history of Palestine. Even after only 58 years and 43 years, respectively, since 1967 and 1982, it's pretty clear, I think any historian would agree, that both of these events had an enormous impact on Palestine, on the Palestinian people, on the Palestinian national movement, and actually on a number of aspects of world events. I'm going to divide the talk today into 4 segments. The first will be to talk a little more about changes in Palestinian society after 1948, the impact of the 48 war on Palestinians and how that not only changed Palestinian society but led to political trends which have played out over the succeeding decades. That's the first topic, and that'll take us up to a topic that I'm going to pass through quickly, which is the 1956 war, the so-called Suez War. So that's the first segment of what I want to talk about tonight. The second segment is the 67 war, the lead up to the 67 war, the way that period saw the creation of the PLO, and right after the war, the takeover of the PLO by militant Palestinian organizations, leading up to a variety of things that we're going to talk about subsequently. But the war also produced a very important document, Security Council Resolution 242. I talked, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, about the importance of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181 in November 1947. I'm going to read you 242 and talk about why it was so important. So that's the second segment of what we'll talk about today. The third segment is going to discuss changes in PLO's strategy from a strategy of liberation of Palestine and creation of a secular democratic state for everybody, which was the original aim of the militant groups that later formed the PLO, to a completely different strategy following the October 1973 war. So I'll talk about that war. I'll talk about the changes that it imposed on the PLO. I'll talk about how the PLO shifted from a strategy of liberation, total liberation, to a strategy of basically a negotiated two-state outcome. Finally, the fourth section, we'll talk about the 82 war, the lead up to it, and the aftermath of it. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to start now with the first section, but before I get into the actual lead up to the 67 war and the multiple factors that caused that war, I want to explain some of the changes in Palestine and among Palestinians and in the region globally in the years leading up to 67, including a little bit about the 56 war. I think I said a bit when I talked about the Nakba, about the impact of that event on Palestinians. I didn't say something that was really quite important. Not only were 3/4 of the Arab population of Palestine expelled from their homes, dispossessed, lost their citizenship, lost their status in the world, their property was stolen. I mean, legalized theft, I guess you would call it. The state of Israel basically appropriated all the property of everybody who left and much of the property of those who stayed. So you had a couple of 100,000 Palestinians who remained Israeli citizens. Much of their property, much of their land was also stolen, appropriated under various bogus pretexts. Much of it, the absentee property law, custodian of absentee property, Israel Lands Authority, a whole rigmarole of semi-legal fictions were created to legalize essentially the theft of the majority of the property in Palestine. Everything within the borders of the state of Israel after the 49 armistices, which was 78% of the land area of mandatory Palestine, and of which Jewish ownership was in the realm of 5 or 6%. So everything else was either state land or privately owned Palestinian land. All of it snapped up, as were bank accounts, as were shops, as were factories, as were orange groves, as were any investment that people had made. Ended up in the pockets of the Israeli state and then was redistributed as the state chose to do. I mentioned, in addition to talking about the devastating impact of the Nakba, I mentioned that the new conditions of exile, of dispersion, dispossession, and so on, led to the eclipse, really the disappearance of the notable class, which had dominated Palestinian Arab society, both economically and politically. They disappear. I mentioned this last time, and it's really important to stress this. They lost the material basis of their social position, of their economic position, when they lost their land, when they lost their bank accounts, and so on. It's easily understood. But it meant that the political space and the economic space was, in effect, opened for new people, new forces to enter. And they were replaced by, I would argue, two forces or two groups. An entirely new bourgeoisie, which begins to develop after 1948, and takes a long time for it to develop, but we see it already in existence within a couple of decades after the 1940s. And a new self-made group of leaders in Beirut, in the Gulf, in Gaza, but not so much in the West Bank and in Amman. These new entrepreneurs and these political activists and militants developed into the new leading elements in Palestinian society. You had a very, very, very few people who came from families that people would have recognized as having either social prestige or political importance after 1948. Really, literally, you could count them almost on the fingers of one hand. Young engineers who graduated from universities in Beirut and Damascus and Cairo, some from universities farther afield, some in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, some in Western Europe, became contractors in the Gulf. The Gulf was building up. There was nothing there before 1948. There was no Qatar. There was an emirate, but there was nothing. None of the towers that you see today. There was nothing in the Emirates. They were little fishing ports, pearling ports. They had commerce, they had trade, there were people, but they were not the megalopolises that we see today. None of this existed. Much of it was built by these contractors, Palestinian contractors, companies like CCC, Medco, there are many of them, Shad and Partners. Some of them were Palestinian companies, some of them were Lebanese companies, some of them were other companies, but they employed Palestinians as engineers, as architects, as masons, as plumbers, as electricians, and so on, as carpenters. And these were people who were beginning to be trained by the UNRWA schools. These are people who had just enough education to manage to get to university, and within a few years, they were filling needs in the oil-producing countries like Libya, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Emirates, and so on. And eventually, they became a large and powerful moneyed class. Today, most of the Jordanian bourgeoisie and a part of the Lebanese bourgeoisie is Palestinian in origin. And then there's a huge network, a transnational network based in London and Athens and the Gulf and different parts of the world of Palestinian entrepreneurs who grew out of this new class, if you want to call it that, of Palestinian entrepreneurs and business people. At the same time, young militants in refugee camps, in high schools, in universities, all over the Arab world, but especially in Cairo, Beirut, and Damascus, began to organize, to do something about what had happened in 1948. They all considered that their elders had failed. They all considered that something entirely new was needed. They were all quite militant. They all were committed to the idea of armed struggle. And many of them were committed to the idea that the Palestinians had to do this themselves. Others said, no, we have to be the triggers, but we have to count on the Arab countries to help us. But all of them were activists, militants, and many of them were perfectly willing to risk their lives, whether based in the Gaza Strip, which was a center of militancy from the very beginning. The Gaza Strip, from the moment the Egyptian army withdrew into that area and Palestinian refugees driven out of the southern parts of what is today Israel escaped into that area, has the highest proportion of refugees of any place in the world, Palestinian refugees, of any place in the Middle East. And so it became a natural breeding ground. These are the most dispossessed of the dispossessed Palestinians, were the population of the Gaza Strip. Most of the population of the Gaza Strip were refugees. And so it's not surprising that it was a center of resistance, not only in the 50s and the 60s, but later on, up until the present. It was also true of refugee camps in Jordan. It was also true in refugee camps in the West Bank, which at that time had been annexed to Jordan to form what we today call the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Abdullah had grabbed a piece of Palestine, as he and the British had been plotting for years and years to do. I better put something on that so it doesn't fly away, or I will lose my notes. I mean, I could do some of this extemporaneously, but I need notes. And so there were many refugee camps in Jordan and in the West Bank, and also in Syria, also in Lebanon, and these were all centers, as were universities, as were high schools, and there were a few other foci of this. And very early on, starting in the early 1950s, people either tried to return, and in many cases succeeded in returning, especially people from Lebanon, refugees who had fled to Lebanon. Many of them managed to sneak across the border. The Lebanese-Palestinian border, today the Lebanese-Israeli border, is very porous. In 1937, one of these British butchers imported from India, in addition to building torture centers, he's a man called Sir Charles Tegart, T-E-G-A-R-T, also constructed what was called the Tegart Line, which was supposed to stop infiltration from Lebanon during the 36-39 revolt. It didn't work, obviously. And that border was porous, and many, many people managed to return, and some of them even managed to get themselves registered inside Israel as citizens. I know dozens of people whose families include members who fled to Lebanon as they were driven out of their villages and then snuck back and managed to stay and get registered as Israeli citizens. So some people were crossing the border to try and return. Other people were crossing the border to try and retrieve property of theirs they'd left behind. Others were crossing the border to harvest their crops, literally across the armistice line. But others were crossing for militant purposes, to attack Israelis, to take revenge, whatever the purpose was. And the names of some of these groups often included the word revenge. Okay, so that was one of the motivations. And eventually some of this began to be organized. And so there were waves of attacks, especially across the armistice line from Gaza, which was ill-defined, and there was no walls, there were no fences, there was nothing. There was barely barbed wire. And across the very long and very porous border between the West Bank and Israel. The attacks from Jordan provoked two things. They provoked fierce Jordanian repression of the Palestinians, of all militancy, for two reasons. First of all, Abdullah and his successor Hussein, his grandson Hussein, intended to keep the West Bank and to incorporate the Palestinians into Jordan. And any indication of Palestinian nationalism, any indication of Palestinian militancy, was a danger to this new Hashemite kingdom that he had created. Secondly, they were scared of the Israelis. Israel had whipped the Arab armies. The only one that had fought creditably was actually the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, so-called. And they did not want their masters in London and later on their masters in Washington didn't want them to allow these attacks to take place. And they did their best to prevent them. One of my cousins who was drafted into the Jordanian army told me they set up ambushes facing eastward to try and trap Palestinian militants who were trying to cross the frontier and attack inside Israel. That was their attempt at repression of the Palestinians. Obviously, many people got through. Many attacks took place. Many Israelis were killed. And Israel then retaliated in ways which showed that the lessons of British counter-insurgency had been put to good use. They had been well trained by the Brits, the officers who commanded these units, Sharon and many others, Alon and so on. And they carried out the same kind of reprisals, so-called, that the British had done in the 30s. In repressing the Great Revolt of 36-39. So you would force people into a house and blow it up over their heads. Hundreds of people were killed in a village called Duwema in 1948, October, just before the ceasefire, just before the armistice. We don't even know how many. There are Israeli accounts that give you very large numbers. There are Jordanian accounts which are somewhat lower. There are UN accounts in the middle. Probably a couple of hundred people killed. Mostly women and children, almost all civilians. There were almost no armed people in this village, apparently, according to almost every report. There was no resistance, according to the Israeli reports. That was just one example. This kind of thing happened again and again. There was a terrible atrocity in a village called Qibya in 1953. Each of these follows an attack in which Israelis are killed, of course. So somebody slips across the frontier. Somebody carries out an attack inside Israel, and the Israeli army comes down, attacking the civilian population. This must be stressed. This nonsense of human shields is a patent lie. This murderous policy is not an Israeli policy. This is counterinsurgency 101, taught to British officers in their textbooks. Sir Charles Colwell, Small Wars, 1896, and used in British military academies for decades, and taught to the paragons of the Palmach and the Haganah. I'm repeating what I said last week, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt. And it became the doctrine of the Israeli army. Now you have an entire propaganda machine devoted to covering up the fact that these are intentional attacks on civilians. That is what they were. That is what they always were. That is what they are. That is what we've been watching for 2 years in Gaza. Whatever pretext may be given, whatever fake AI garbage is taken off the web and put together as the command center under Shifa Hospital, the attack on the hospital had an intention which had nothing to do with Hamas militants and so on. There was no headquarters under the Shifa Hospital, incidentally. We now know that for sure. The point is, this is not something that the Israelis invented. This is something they were trained to do by the masters of this art of counterinsurgency. And they carried out these reprisals, whether in Egypt, directing them initially both against refugee camps, but also against the Egyptian army, and in Jordan, directing them mainly against civilians. Now, I want to talk about Egypt briefly. It's very important to understand what happens now, because this gives us both the background to the 56 Sinai War and to the 1967 war. Because this militancy emerging from the Gaza Strip, these attacks on Israeli settlements along the border of the Gaza Strip, were something that the Egyptians tried just as hard as the Jordanians to repress. You can read the memoirs of Abu Iyad. You can read an excellent biography of Arafat. And they talk about how the Egyptian intelligence service devoted their energies to trying to stop them from doing what they were doing. They would interrogate them, they would arrest them, they would jail them, they would torture them to try and stop them from doing this. The Egyptians had absolutely no desire to get into another war with Israel in which they knew they would be whipped, as they were in 1948. And equally importantly, after the 1952 military coup, the so-called revolution in Egypt, Egypt had not built up its armed forces. Now you read Abdel Nasser's memoir, Philosophy of the Revolution, and he says our eyes were on the enemy in the battlefield in Palestine, but our hearts were back in, I'm paraphrasing, our hearts were back in Egypt, thinking of why we were sent out with inferior weapons, why we were not supported by the monarchy. And this was the impetus for us to overthrow this corrupt regime. After the revolution, they did not build up the Egyptian army. They tried to devote all possible resources to development. The building of the high dam, eventually called the Aswan Dam, the building of the irrigation of much larger areas through the building of canals and so on and so forth, development of industry, building infrastructure and so on and so forth. These attacks, especially 1955 and 1956 when they peaked, potently humiliated the Egyptian government. You guys came to power partly because of the humiliation of 1948, because the army was no good, because of the monarchy. Now you're getting, the Israelis are attacking, killing 50 soldiers or 40 policemen. What are you doing? You haven't developed any capabilities to defend Egypt, or in this case, the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, and I'm going to come back to Egypt in a minute, meanwhile, there'd been a division in the Israeli leadership over how to deal with the Arabs. There's an article among your readings by Avi Shleim about these differences, the Middle East Journal article. I have a couple of things by him. But this is a brilliant article he wrote very long ago, in which he talks about the differences in particular between Ben Gurion, who was on and off prime minister, and Moshe Sharet, who was foreign minister and then prime minister under Ben Gurion, and then prime minister when Ben Gurion retired, though he immediately came back into office. Sharet was a diplomat. He had headed the political department, which became the foreign ministry, and the Jewish agency became the foreign ministry of the State of Israel. He'd been the one who negotiated with Emir Abdullah, secret negotiations before 1948. He knew a little Arabic, which Ben Gurion didn't know. Ben Gurion knew some Ottoman Turkish. He knew no Arabic. And he thought that a modus vivendi could perhaps be found with the Arabs without making any concessions. He wasn't willing to withdraw from the areas Israel had occupied in 48 beyond the partition lines. He wasn't willing to consider the return of refugees, but he thought that it was possible to have an approach to the Arabs which wasn't based solely on force. Ben Gurion disagreed. Ben Gurion sincerely believed that only force was to put it differently, the only suitable means for dealing with the Arabs was force. And he had collected around him a coterie of young lions, people like Moshe Dayan, people like Ariel Sharon, in his capacity for a while as defense minister. And these hard men had the same attitude as he did. Over time, Ben Gurion undermined Sharet. Even when Sharet was prime minister, Ben Gurion, through the people who were his followers, as it were, continuously undermined Sharet. I'm not suggesting Sharet was necessarily going to make a just peace. I'm simply saying Sharet had a different approach. And read, it's a well-nuanced article by Avi Shleim if you're interested. From the beginning of this pattern of attacks by Palestinian militants from the Gaza Strip and Israeli retaliations on both the refugee camps and the Egyptian army, Ben Gurion advocated war with Egypt. He could not get a majority of the cabinet to support him. Sharet would not go along. But in 1956, after he returned to government, he finally got his way. And one of the reasons he got his way is that the Egyptians, having taken blow after blow after blow, and having turned to the United States for weapons, and having been denied by Washington with weapons, and having had a loan that the United States promised to the World Bank to build the dam withdrawn, did two things. They nationalized the Suez Canal, Egypt, and they turned to the Soviet Union for arms. And that was the trigger for Ben Gurion. He was able to overcome the reservations in his cabinet and get a decision for war. I've already said the new regime in Egypt had refrained from building up the military and had, in fact, gotten American support from the very beginning. The CIA was supportive of the coup. Why? Can anybody guess why? They wanted to replace the Brits. It's very simple. The new power wanted to replace the old power. The monarchy was a British creation. The British had created the Egyptian monarchy in 1922. Boom! You're king. We had made you Sultan. Before that, you were Khedive, which is a title given by the Ottomans. They had made somebody Sultan, and then they made the same guy king. So the monarchy and the whole political structure was dominated by the British. The United States pulled the rug out from under them with the coup. The coup was an Egyptian event, but the United States supported it. And it continued to support the regime for a couple of years. But things came to a crisis. The United States withheld the World Bank loan. John Foster Dulles was not as bright as his predecessors had been. The 52 election had brought the Republicans into office, and in 53, Dulles becomes Secretary of State. John Foster, his brother Alan, becomes director of the CIA, and American policy towards Egypt hardens. And eventually, the Egyptians feel themselves to be forced into the arms of the Soviets. They get a so-called Czech arms deal. It's actually Soviet weapons mainly. And they begin to rebuild their military. Now, this doesn't happen until 56. And Ben-Gurion says, here's our chance. These guys have just not even received these weapons. And if they've received them, they haven't trained on them. This is our chance. And he manages, Israel manages, to cut a deal with two imperial powers that were smarting at what the Egyptians had just done. The British and the French owned the Suez Canal. It's an Anglo-French company. It's today a water company, by the way. Suez. Look it up. Or if you're French, you know that. But in those days, it ran and owned the Suez Canal, and all the profits accrued to the stockholders. The British and the French were outraged that these uppity Egyptians had stolen their canal. Of course, the people who died building it were Egyptians. The work that dug the canal was mainly not machinery. It was mainly fellahin conscripted to do the dirty work, and thousands of them died. It was the blood that built it, in other words, was Egyptian. But in any case, after Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, the British and the French had every reason to try and overthrow him. The French, additional reasons, because something had happened in 1954, which is the Algerian Revolution had broken out. And the Egyptians were supporting the Algerians strongly with their radio broadcasts, by giving them diplomatic presence in Cairo, by helping arm them and train them, and by propagandizing for them all over the Arab world. The French were livid. They were undermining the French position in Algeria. They were undermining the French position in Morocco and Tunisia. They were undermining the British position in the Gulf and in other British semi-colonies like Iraq and Jordan. The British were livid. And so they got together with the Israelis. They cut a deal in Sèvres in France just before the 56 war. And they put together a scenario whereby they claimed that after fighting had started between Egypt and Israel, Britain and France intervened in order to separate the combatants. Now, what did that mean? That meant that the British and the French landed in the Suez Canal, defeated the Egyptian army, and took over the canal again, and said, we're separating the two sides. Meanwhile, the Israeli army overran the Egyptians and arrived at the canal. Sorry about that. I did not realize that would happen. I apologize. And it all seemed to be for the best in the best of all possible worlds, for the old imperialists and for the Israeli army. The Israeli soldiers were dipping their toes in the canal. The Egyptians and the British and the French had retaken their canal. And that was that. But 1956 was not 1856 or 1756, when Britain and France dictated everything globally. Two powers much, much greater than Britain and France immediately intervened, which is to say the United States and the Soviet Union. The Americans, because nobody had asked them. You don't do these things without our permission, Washington said. Who the hell do you think you are in London and Paris and in Tel Aviv? Who do you think you are? We are the great power. You are our clients. And you have just done something we didn't want you to do. And the additional reason, just besides amor propria and American arrogance, or the arrogance of John Foster Dulles in particular, was that the Eisenhower administration was trying to make a big deal of the Soviet invasion of Hungary at the very same time. And here were these neo-colonial powers carrying out an old-fashioned imperialist attack on a former colony at a time when the Americans wanted all the attention to be on Budapest. The Soviets, A, wanted to cover up what they were doing in Budapest, and B, even more important, wanted to make these colonial powers look like the neo-colonial monsters that they were. And so both sides, for different reasons, of the superpower equation, opposed the Anglo-French-Israeli tripartite aggression, this is the term that's usually used in the Arab world, on Egypt. And the irony of this, of course, is that United States and the Soviet Union in 1956 were on the same side, just as they had been in 1947, but they were on a different side. In 1947, they supported Israel and supported partition, and then supported Israel. In 1956, they both supported Egypt against Israel, Britain, and France. They immediately booted the French and the British out. They left with their tail between their legs. The British government collapsed. Sorry about that. The British government collapsed, and the reign or the hegemony of the British and the French in the Middle East was clearly ended forever. Israel was also forced to withdraw in a humiliating fashion. Ben-Gurion thought he could get away with it. He couldn't. He tried to stay longer than he was supposed to, but by 1957, the Americans issued an ultimatum, and he left. Israel left. Now, the Cold War rivalry continued unabated, even though the two powers had been on the same side briefly over the attack on Egypt, with the Soviet Union aligning itself more with the Arabs and the United States mainly avoiding too close a relationship with Israel. Now, why was this? Until President Johnson came into office after the assassination of Kennedy in December '63. This is for a couple of reasons. Kennedy and his advisors saw the utility of using Arab nationalism against communism in a variety of Middle Eastern countries. In Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, they backed the regime or forces that were anti-communist. And these were Arab nationalist forces. This was Abdel Nasser himself, this was leaders in Syria, and this was various parties in Iraq, and who ultimately, in fact, took over from the regime that was leaning towards the Soviet Union in Iraq. You don't need to know the inter-Arab politics, but what's clear here is that Kennedy had a more sophisticated understanding of things than his successor did. Now, I don't think we should be surprised. Johnson was very unlike Kennedy in a number of ways. One of them was that Kennedy actually knew a little bit about the Middle East. He had actually been there. Imagine an American president who didn't just go and get an airplane or, investments in his businesses, but actually spent some time investigating and writing reports. He wrote a report on Palestine in 1939 to his father, who at the time was U.S. ambassador in London, which you can read today and see this guy actually understood some stuff. He actually figured some stuff out. Now, I don't know who he talked to. I don't know who his informants were, but whoever he had listened to them very carefully, and he had absorbed it, and he regurgitated it pretty intelligently. This is a man who knew a little bit about the world. He traveled in Europe, he traveled in the Middle East, he ended up in World War II in the Pacific. He was a worldly person. He was a rich, spoiled brat, a Nepo baby, if you want. But he wasn't ignorant, is my point. He had some knowledge of the world. And his treatment of the Arab world was quite sophisticated. In terms of the things that I've just talked about. And he understood that Israel was an ally and Israel had to be backed, but he was clear on the fact that there were certain things that Israel was trying to do, like develop a nuclear weapon with the help of the French, which he really didn't want them to do. He saw the problems that might cause, and he was quite limited in his support of Israel in various respects, even though under Kennedy, the first American arms sales to Israel took place of Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. He said, we'll sell you defensive weapons. If you think the Arabs are too strong, then we'll sell you defensive weapons. It was only under his successor, under Johnson, that more serious weapon systems were sold to Israel. Johnson, by contrast, had hardly ever left the United States. I believe he left the US once as a Navy reserve officer doing some kind of informational stuff somewhere outside the United States. I believe that's the only time he ever left the United States before he became president. I'm not sure of that. I'd have to read the Caro biographies, which I just don't have the time for. In any case, he was not a worldly man. He was a brilliant politician. He was a master of Senate legerdemain. But he didn't know much about the world. And unlike Kennedy, he listened to his advisors and pretty much did what they told him. Kennedy told his advisors what he wanted. It was a little bit like the transition between Roosevelt and Truman. Truman was a man who didn't know the world. Roosevelt had been Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt was rich. Roosevelt had traveled. Roosevelt knew a great deal. Roosevelt had supervised the transition of the U.S. Navy from coal to oil. He understood the strategic importance of oil the way, you and I understand what the subway fare is today, okay? It was something that was in his bones. The man, he was a worldly, intelligent a person who knew a great deal about strategic issues. That certainly was not true of Harry Truman. He served as a captain in artillery in World War I. That's the only time he left the United States. Okay? So he'd been in France, fired a few shells, and came back. Or ordered his subordinates to fire a few shells. And very much like the transition from FDR to Truman, the new president really ended up a plaything of his advisors. And we would see the effect of that in subsequent years. Under Johnson, the American posture towards Israel changes completely. The United States and Israel become allies. The United States becomes the main supplier of weapon systems to Israel. Israel's war in 1948 was fought largely with American and Czech weapons. But the wars it fought after that, 56 and 67, were fought almost entirely with British and French weapons, mainly French aircraft, but also British tanks. It was only after the 67 war that Israel began to be supplied in a massive way with American weapons. And that was Lyndon Johnson. So this sets the scene. I'm now moving on to part two of what we want to talk about. I want to talk now about the 67 war. All that I've talked about sets the scene for 67. A situation of great power polarization, a situation in which the Middle East is becoming an increasingly important arena of the Cold War, a situation where the Soviets are much more closely aligned with the Arab, so-called progressive regimes, not very progressive, though they did a lot of things that were, they increased education. They did land reform. They did a number of things that were really important in terms of infrastructure, but they weren't progressive in terms of their domestic policies in many, many ways. Meanwhile, the United States was aligned with the so-called reactionary regimes, all of the conservative monarchies, and of course with Israel. And in this situation, there developed what one of the most important analysts of the history of this period, a man called Malcolm Kerr, called the Arab Cold War. A Cold War as between Arab powers, which tracked with but was separate from the overall Cold War. So the United States was aligned with the conservative regimes, Soviets aligned with the more, I suppose you'd say, progressive regimes. But in fact, the Cold War had its own dynamic, which had nothing to do with, the Arab Cold War had its own dynamic, which had nothing to do with the big Cold War. I'm going to move on now. I'm going to come back to this in a sec, but I want to move on to the Palestinians. Because by the early 1960s, and certainly by the mid-1960s, Palestinian nationalism was experiencing a major resurgence in Beirut, in Cairo, Damascus, in the Gulf, among the Gulf countries, especially Kuwait. Kuwait had a large Palestinian population. Kuwait had a school system which is far more developed than any place in the entire Arabian Peninsula. Going back to the early 20th century, there were modern secular schools in Kuwait. Rashid passed through on his way to India, and he said, you guys have to have modern schools. You can't not to train your people. And so Kuwait was much more advanced in a variety of ways and was more able to benefit from the expertise of Palestinian and Lebanese and Egyptian experts whom they brought in to build up their society, and had their own trained people as well, unlike early on Saudi Arabia or the smaller Gulf countries. And so Kuwait became a reservoir of Palestinian nationalism, had a huge Palestinian community, which was prosperous, and which the Kuwaitis said, as long as you don't mess with our politics, you do whatever you want. Okay? Don't get us in trouble. Don't say anything bad about Al-Sabah, about the ruling dynasty, and you're good. So there were Palestinian schools, there was fundraising for all of these Palestinian militant groups based in Kuwait. You had a variety of groups that developed, something called the Arab National Movement, which was a pan-Arab organization, but was largely Palestinian, and the beginnings of what became Fatah. Early on, as early as the late 50s, these guys were already operating. Even though Fatah was technically started in January 1965, it was in existence long before this. This increased militancy, this growth in Palestinian nationalism, led to an increasing pace of cross-border attacks on Israel. There were a variety of reasons for this, besides the fact that a new generation of Palestinian leadership had taken over, and these newly educated young people were really eager to do something about the Nakba, to reverse its effects. But there were a variety of things, if you think about the early to mid 1960s. One of them was that the Algerian Revolution had succeeded. The Algerians succeeded in defeating the French Empire. And liberating themselves. and expelling most of the colons, most of the pieds noirs, most of the French settlers. The Vietnam War was on. You had people reading both the writings of Frantz Fanon and other Algerian writers. You had them reading the writings of Mao. You had them reading the writings of Guevara. You had them paying enormous attention to what was going on in Southeast Asia. And that affected people all over the Arab world. And then in 1966, something changed which had a big impact on the pace of attacks on Israel. And this was the coming to power in I think February of 1966, of a new regime in Damascus, the so-called Neo-Ba'ath regime. I don't want to tell you about the Neo-Ba'ath. You don't need to know anything about them, except one thing. Several of the most important leaders were doctors who had served in Algeria with the FLN. So they came to Damascus after liberation of, came back to Damascus after liberation of Algeria with a clear idea in their head that what Mao called long-term people's war could actually succeed. And anybody with eyes to see could see that it looked like it might succeed in Vietnam. It was succeeding, or it could succeed. And this was enormously influential throughout the Arab world, but it was particularly important in Syria. Because what the new regime did was to reverse the policy of most Arab regimes, which was to talk big on Palestine and put Palestinian militants in jail. Make sure they didn't attack Israel and didn't expose them to Israeli attacks. So this regime really was the first one to consistently support Palestinian militancy with one condition. The attacks not be from Syrian soil. You go through Lebanon or you go through Jordan. Don't attack them from here. So the reprisals would not be on Syria. The reprisals would be on Lebanon or Jordan. It was a shrewd tactic. And the Palestinians took advantage of it. And the Israelis responded in their usual way, their usual brutal way. And so you had increasing tensions, really, from February 1966 in a way that had no precedent. I mean, my father worked in political Security Council affairs. He sat in the Security Council every time they discussed the Middle East, which was 50% of the work of the Security Council from the founding of the UN until the 70s. Half of the sessions of the Security Council dealt with the Middle East. And so he would come home at night and say, this is what happened on the Syrian frontier. This is the attack that just took place in this place. This is what the observers reported. And you could not follow this in the New York Times, which reported everything from an Israeli perspective. Everything is seen through a certain lens in the New York Times. They had an article the other day. I couldn't believe it. There was not one single quote from somebody who was not either Israeli or David Sanger and another guy, I forget the other journalist, or an American diplomat who worked, as Aaron David Miller said, as a lawyer for Israel. That's what Miller said of what he and his colleagues did, and Brett McGurk, and those kinds of people, and Tony Blinken. Those kinds of people were quoted, and a bunch of Israelis, former Israeli chief of intelligence, former Israeli this, former that. The blindness, the narrowness of that perspective is astonishing. I had to read the New York Times when I was a kid. That's the paper we got. But I actually heard what was happening from my father. Or I could go and sit in the visitors gallery and watch the sessions and listen to the UN observers, who are American naval officers and Norwegians and so on and so forth, say, this is what we saw. These are the bodies underneath the houses that were blown up. This is the number of people we counted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Going on the Israeli side, going on the Jordanian or the Lebanese or the Syrian side to do their observer work. So all of this was taking place amidst, we have this new regime in Syria, we have this rise in militancy. All of this is taking place in a situation where the Arab Cold War was really heating up around, in particular, a civil war in Yemen. In 1962, the reactionary monarchy was overthrown, a bunch of army officers proclaiming themselves the free officers, along the lines of what the Egyptians called themselves, had taken power. Egypt ended up supporting, of course, the Republicans. Saudi Arabia ended up supporting, of course, the Royalists, and everybody else lined up. So the Palestinians and the Syrians and so on lined up with the Republic. Soviet Union helped the Republic. Saudi Arabia, Britain, the United States, and Israel supported the Royalists. The Israelis were dropping weapons as early as 1963 in support of the Royalists, and sending some of their experts to help them. But most of the work was done by the Brits and the Saudis. The Americans and the Saudis the Americans and the Israelis were secondary. This war didn't go very well for the Republic. The royalists, who were based incidentally in the northern part of Yemen, where Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis, are based today, were a tough lot. And you really don't want to mess with them. I mean, there are a few Roman armies that have disappeared. One of them disappeared in Yemen. We do not know what happened to those legions. They went to conquer Yemen and they never came back, and we do not know what happened. There was a battle of Tannenberg, there was a battle with the Persians in which Roman armies were defeated, but we know where they were defeated. And we recently found the Tannenberg forest where those legions disappeared. There's all kinds of evidence, archaeological evidence. Same thing with when the Parthians defeated. We don't know where the Yemenis defeated the Romans. They just disappeared off the face of the earth. It's not a place you want to invade. It's just a piece of advice to would-be imperial powers. Anyway, Abd al-Nasser was on the wrong side of this. I mean, maybe the Republic was a good thing and the monarchy was bad, but you don't want to mess with these people. And he sent 60,000 of his troops and half of his officer corps and a large chunk of his air force in a failing effort to support the Republic. The Republic eventually survived, but after the Egyptians had withdrawn in 1968. That's another story. We're not going to talk about Yemeni history tonight. So Abd al-Nasser had half of his army tied down in Yemen. Not half, but a large chunk of his army tied down in Yemen. Egypt was now spending a fortune on the Yemen war, money they didn't have. The Syrians were helping the Palestinians to provoke Israel with a heightened series of attacks. And Abd al-Nasser was in a difficult situation. In this situation of an Arab Cold War, he could not afford to alienate one of his few allies, which is this extreme militant Syrian regime. Even though it was radical, even though it was doing things he didn't want them to do. The Egyptians and the Jordanians had done their best to stop attacks. In fact, there were almost no attacks from the Gaza Strip from the end of the '56 war until 1967. The Egyptian Mukhabarat did their work. The Jordanians were not capable of it. It was much too long a frontier. The army wasn't big enough. They tried. All of this, plus the friction between the president, Abd al-Nasser, and his aggressive army chief of staff, Abd al-Hakim Amir, led to a situation in which Israel was able to really quite handily defeat Egypt in 1967. I'm going to come to some of the details in a minute, but the Yemen war being pulled around, pushed around by the Palestinians with the aid of the new regime in Damascus, plus a situation where he was not in full control of his own army. Khalid Fahmy, the historian who teaches now at Tufts, is working on this, working on the internal Egyptian situation from memoirs, and he's finding out incredible things about the relationship between Abd al-Nasser and his generals, Abd al-Nasser and Abd al-Hakim Amir, and all of the deep reasons for this terrible defeat of 1967, many of which are internal, clearly. So all of this led to what ended up being the '67 war. Amir was aggressive. He constantly urged escalatory steps. The Egyptians eventually closed the Straits of Tiran, which were the only exit from the port of Eilat to the Red Sea. They asked the United Nations Emergency Force that had been installed between Egypt and Israel after the '56 war to withdraw. The Egyptian army entered Sinai. In particular, the closing of the straits and the removal of the UN forces were violations of the agreements that had been signed at the end of the '56 war. So they were provocations on the part of Egypt. And what we know now, largely from Khalid's research, though some historians have pointed to it before, is that Abd al-Nasser was really very badly served by his own military. These were highly unwise actions. And they were highly unwise, in particular, in view of Israel's absolute military superiority over the Egyptians. Now, Arab public opinion, and Israeli public opinion for that matter, did not realize this. In Israel, there was a perception that a new Holocaust was possible, that this was an existential threat to the very existence of Israel, that Israel's very life was endangered, that the Egyptians and their Arab allies would overrun Israel. Abd al-Hakim Amir seems to have had some of the same delusions, as did many people in Arab public opinion. They said, well, if all the Arab armies get together, they have to be able to beat Israel. This time, they got whipped in '48, they got whipped in '56. This time, certainly they can do it. The people who knew that that wasn't the case were people paid to know about things in our government, paid by our taxes, trained by our taxes, and in this case, they actually knew what they were talking about. Not always the case. When Israel decided it was going to go to war and launch a preemptive attack on Egypt, they sent the head of the Mossad, a man named Meir Amit, to Washington to get permission for the attack that took place on the 5th of June. Israel did not want to make the mistake of 1956 when it went to war without permission. This time, they wanted permission from the superpower. And they, of course, duly got it. But they got a green light. But they also were told by the president, who met with him, with Meir Amit, Johnson himself, by the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Wheeler. They were told by all of them, and by the CIA, that their assessment was that Israel would crush all of the Arab armies, whether Israel launched a preemptive attack or not, whether it let Egypt attack first, which in fact we now know the Egyptians weren't intending to do, though Ahmed was making all these provocative gestures, there was no decision to attack. So the United States knew, the Israeli military knew, but most people actually did not know. There was almost hysteria in Israel, and there was wild excitement in Arab countries, thinking the Arabs this time were strong enough to defeat Israel. As we know, they were not. Now, the Arab defeat was total. It took 6 days, 7 days, from the 5th to the 10th. Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, the Sinai, the Golan Heights, from Jordan, which controlled the first 3 from Egypt and from Syria. Now, while the United States had supported Israel in 1948, it didn't give Israel permission. The Israelis fought a war that they planned to fight, and they fought it. They felt they had to fight it. In 1956, the United States obviously did not give permission. In fact, the United States was outraged. And in the 1950s and the 60s, the United States was not terribly supportive of Israel diplomatically. There's a scad of UN Security Council resolutions condemning Israel in the 50s and into the early 60s, which means the United States had not vetoed them, meaning the United States was willing to sanction Israel, not necessarily very severely, but at least to say, this is wrong, and we condemn it. All of this changes with the 67 war and in the lead up to 67. And as a result of Johnson's increasing sense that Israel is a reliable ally and proxy against Soviet proxies like Egypt and Syria and so on. Between 1948 and the early 60s, the United States feebly tried to get Israel to give back some of its gains of the 48 war. The Israelis were intransigent. Tried to get the Israelis to accept the return of some Palestinian refugees. The Israelis were intransigent. And at a couple of times tried to initiate negotiations between the two sides, and nothing came of them. Itamar Rabinovich has a good book on this, by the way, about attempts to negotiate in the 50s and 60s. And finally, the United States desisted from all of that. 1967 war was the first war that Israel fought with U.S. approval and full support. It supported them in 48, but they hadn't asked for their permission. All of this, importantly, is taking place against the background of the Vietnam War, which is beginning to go not so well for the United States, okay? 67 was well before the Tet Offensive, which was a clear indication the United States couldn't win. But already by 67, this was not going well. I talked to somebody, who was this guy I talked to? He was driving an Uber in D.C. yesterday. And he said he was drafted in 68. And he said they needed everybody they could get. They desperately needed everybody they could get. They knew this thing wasn't going well. This is before Tet. He was drafted, actually. He said they took everybody. I was with 23 people from my class drafted, his graduating class from college. And that was the case for quite a while. So 67, the war wasn't going well, and everybody in Washington was obsessed with it and was seeing everything in terms of Soviet proxies. There was this idea that Vietnam was a Soviet proxy. And they saw the Middle East in the same terms. Egypt didn't have its own independent policies. It was a Soviet proxy. Ditto Iraq, ditto Syria, and so on and so forth. Unlike the much more nuanced view of the people in the Kennedy administration or the Eisenhower administration, these people saw things purely in Cold War terms. And Israel became much more closely aligned with the United States, and that became the basis of what became really an alliance between the two powers for the first time. This involved military support on the highest level. The United States gives top-of-the-line equipment only to a very, very few powers. Today, the F-35, which of course Israel has scads of. In those days, the F-4 Phantom, which was the top air superiority aircraft. It was better than anything the Soviets produced. It was better than anything anybody else produced. And starting in 1968, the United States started to give Israel Phantoms. The problem was they couldn't give them enough because they were getting shot down over Vietnam, and the production, McDonnell Douglas production out in St. Louis, was limited. They could only produce so many planes. And so the United States was able to give Israel some, but it could not give them as many as they wanted, and that became important in a minute. I'll talk about how that became important. But I want to talk first about something that really was entirely new, which was the total alignment of the United States diplomatically with Israel's objectives. And we see this in Security Council Resolution 242. Nominally, which was passed on November 22nd, 1967, three or 4 months after the after the June War. Nominally, it was drafted by the British ambassador, Lord Cadogan. Cadogan. Any British historians here? Anybody remember a previous Lord Cadogan? Charge of the Light Brigade? Anybody? Crimean War? He's the commander of the Light Brigade. His great-grandfather or whoever. Anyway, so he was, the grandfather supervised one disaster. The grandson or great-grandson supervised this disaster. But he was just the drafter. The muscle behind 242 was the United States, with the Israelis sitting on their shoulder telling them what they thought would be best put in this resolution. Ambassador Goldberg was very close to Israel. He was the drafter with Khalidi and with the Israeli ambassador, Abba Eban. Actually, Abba Eban was foreign minister, but he was here all of that time. And this became the basis for everything that was supposed to be done thereafter. This is the basis to this day, nominally, for peace in the Middle East. I'm going to read you some of the text of 242. The Security Council expressing its continuing concern with the grave situation in the Middle East. And the next sentence is important. Emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and the need to work for a just and lasting peace in which every state in the area can live in security. That paragraph, that sentence, inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, is the part that the Arabs cling on to. They say you can't annex occupied territory if you are in compliance with 242. It then lists a couple of things that should be principles for the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. The first is withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. I want you to think about that. Withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Not all of the territories. Not the territories. Not all territories. From territories. And this was a gap you can drive a Mack truck through. And the Israelis have, of course, used it. They say, Security Council Resolution 242 doesn't say we have to give up everything. It says territories. A little bit here, a little bit there, maybe nothing, whatever. Not nothing, no, territories, obviously, something. That's the first. The second of these principles for the establishment of a just and lasting peace is termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. You accept this resolution, and you accept two things. You have to have a peaceful resolution. You have to accept the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of your opponent. And you have to withdraw armed forces from some, but not necessarily all, territories that were occupied in the recent conflict. There are a couple of other interesting clauses, but I'll only read one. Affirms further the necessity, A, freedom of navigation, B, for achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem. Which refugees? Not entirely clear. Probably meant the Palestinians, but they're not mentioned. What is a just settlement? Doesn't say. So you have UN resolutions going back to 1948 which say, Resolution 194, December 1948, Palestinian refugees must return, have the right of return and to be compensated. This is basically wiped out in 242. The very mention of the Palestinians doesn't occur in this resolution. In this, it's quite similar to the Balfour Declaration or the Mandate for Palestine. Palestinians don't exist in this resolution. There are refugees who deserve a just solution, whatever that means. So that's 242, and the importance of it is it consecrates a complete alignment of the United States on Israeli desiderata. This could have been written by the Israelis themselves. There's nothing in it that they wouldn't have approved of. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Abba Eban was as involved in the drafting as Lord Cadogan was. I have no evidence of that, but I believe that's the case. In any case, he, Goldberg, Cadogan, and with some input from the French and Soviet and other representatives in the Security Council, produced this. I want to move now back to the Palestinians. That's 242, that's the 67 war. I want to move back to the Palestinians. The 67 war ended the illusion among many Palestinians that the Arab states would or could do anything about their cause. They realized the Arabs were not able, even if they were willing, and they probably weren't willing, to do anything about Palestine. They had yet, the Arab states, to accept 242. They had yet to say, yes, we accept that the thing has to be resolved peacefully. Yes, we accept to recognize the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Israel. They hadn't yet said that, but everybody could see which way the wind was blowing. And the Palestinians certainly could see that. There was therefore a turn towards self-reliance on the part of the Palestinians. This had always been the line of Fatah. They always said, you can't count on the Arab governments. We have to do it ourselves. We have to spark a revolution, which will in turn lead Arab masses to follow us, which will force the governments. Don't count on the governments. They'll never do anything. Other Palestinian militants in groups like the Arab National Movement, others who joined the Ba'ath Party, said, no, we will do it, we will start it, but the Arab governments have to be with us and we have to respect them and let them take the lead. This basically shifted things in favor of Fatah. This resulted, this realization among Palestinians, the shock of the occupation of the rest of Palestine. I mean, all of mandatory Palestine was now under Israeli control and has been, of course, ever since. The shock of all of this, the shock of yet another phase of the Nakba. We know that 750,000 Palestinians were expelled in 1948. Probably very few people realize that as many as 300,000 Palestinians were expelled after the 67 war. The entire population of the refugee camps in the Jordan River Valley. Tens of thousands of residents of Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of residents of villages that Israel emptied along the DMZ. Villages that had been strongholds of the Jordanian army around Latrun, Imwes, and so on. Beit Yaru and so on. About 300,000 people were kicked out in 1967 from mainly the West Bank, but also from the Gaza Strip. And Israel continued to try and induce people to leave. Voluntary departures, of course, in their lexicon. All of this, the shock of all of this, resulted in an explosion of support for the Palestinian resistance movement among Palestinians all over the world, among the Arab populations. The Arab governments were seen to have failed yet again, as in 1948. The Arab governments were seen to be willing, apparently, to deal with Israel in ways that people still couldn't accept. And so the PLO was able to put pressure on Arab governments by appealing over their heads to Arab public opinion. And this was a pattern that continues for most of the 60s, and we'll see when it ends later on in the 1970s. The PLO had been formed in 1964, Palestine Liberation Organization, essentially as a tool of the Arab governments to repress Palestinian nationalism. The idea was there is this bubbling among Palestinians. They're going to get us into trouble. They're going to start a war with Israel. We want to control this process. And so the PLO was originally established essentially by the Egyptians to control the Palestinians. By 1968, Palestinian factions had taken it over. Yasser Arafat becomes the head of the PLO, and they are able to use this as a means to appeal to world public opinion, but also to Arab public opinion over the heads of the regimes, and put great pressure on them for a number of years. Egypt, of course, tried desperately to retake the initiative. I'll talk about the war of attrition in a minute as a lead up to discussion of the October War. But what's important in concluding this second section, how are we doing for time? Yeah, we're good. Is that the Palestinians Palestinian society was galvanized by what the Palestinians called the Palestinian Revolution. And this led to great instability in countries where there were large populations of Palestinians, like Jordan, like Lebanon, like Syria, from the mid-60s onwards. And we're going to see how that worked to the disadvantage of the Palestinians a little later on. Okay, so we're finished the second section of what I wanted to talk about. I want to talk now about the war of attrition, the Arab acceptance of 242, and the October War, leading up to the October War, and how that affected the PLO. This is a really important and really underappreciated period, because the time when the PLO shifts from what I would call a liberation movement, or what saw itself as a liberation movement, or tried to be a liberation movement, to essentially, I don't know how to describe it, something very like the Arab regimes, essentially accepting the international order's imposition on it. Up until a certain point, the PLO was a rebel in the international comity of nations, comity, not comedy. Very much like the FLN in Algeria, very much like the Vietnamese National Liberation Movement. They had support from some parties, but essentially what they were trying to do was overturn the established order. This changes as a result of the events we're going to talk about in this section, the third section of the talk tonight. I think it can be argued that for most of the 1960s, Palestinian activism and militant activity drove the pace of events where the Arabs in Israel were concerned. They helped to provoke the June War. I mean, essentially, you can say the Syrians, by the way they allowed the Palestinians to operate, the Palestinians especially by their constant attacks and increasing pace of attacks on Israel, and also the Egyptians by their inability to understand that having half their army in Yemen, or a large chunk of their army in Yemen, they really should not, could not, must not allow Israel to take any provocation like asking the United Nations Emergency Force to withdraw or closing the Straits of Tiran, because this would be a catastrophe. So there are many, many reasons for the war. Another reason, of course, is that the Israeli military was itching to go. They knew that people almost had nervous breakdowns until the government accepted to let them attack. There are stories of Rabin having a nervous, he's the chief of staff, having a nervous breakdown because they wouldn't say yes. I have my air force ready to go. I want to do this. I want to do this. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. But this is what the accounts of people who were there say. The man was on the point of frenzy because he didn't get the order to go. Not because they thought they would be defeated, because they knew they could whip them. And they knew that if they launched a preemptive attack, they could whip them even more thoroughly, which, of course, is what happened. So all of these things, I think, drove the pace of events, but particularly Palestinian activism. And all of this helped not only provoke the June War, but it pushed the Arab regimes to positions they might not otherwise have taken. And it put the Palestinians back on the world map. 242 continued a process that starts with the Balfour Declaration of removing the Palestinians, erasing the Palestinians. The only thing that's there is a Jewish national home. The only thing that's there is the state of Israel. Egypt occupies a little piece. Jordan occupies a little piece. There's no Palestine. There are no Palestinians. 242 consecrates that. What the PLO manages to do in the subsequent years is to put Palestine back on the map. First of all, they get the recognition of the Arab League in 1964, that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And the next thing they get is Arafat invited to the General Assembly. And the next thing they get is the recognition of more countries that end up recognizing Palestine than recognize the state of Israel within a few decades. And this, whatever you think of the PLO, and I have strong criticisms of the PLO. This is an achievement which no earlier Palestinian leadership ever managed to do, ever had the capability or the vision or the support, popular support, to do. Now, the Rabat Summit in 1974, which recognized the PLO, whereby the Arab states recognized the PLO as sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, had a consequence of pushing Jordan out as the interlocutor for the West Bank. Now, the United States still didn't accept this. Israel, of course, didn't accept this. You can read the 1977 Likud party platform. I'm going to read you a piece of it in a minute, in which they basically say the PLO is just a tool of a bunch of terrorists who are a tool of the Arab governments. There's no such thing as Palestinians. But a lot of countries in the world began to realize, a lot of peoples, and then eventually a lot of regimes and governments came to realize that the Palestinians existed, that they had a cause, and that, in fact, that cause should be supported. Now, all of this did not happen with the blessing of Arab governments. The Arab governments in 1974 did not crown the PLO sole representative because they liked their brown eyes. They did it because Arab public opinion was still supportive of the Palestinians. They did it because the Palestinians were able to appeal, as I've said, over their heads to their public opinion. But they were nevertheless making an effort, these regimes, especially the Egyptians, to retake the initiative. And they did this through a war which is very little remembered, even though it had a lot of casualties. It was the so-called War of Attrition from 1968 to 1970, mainly fought along the Suez Canal between the Egyptian army on the west bank of the canal and the Israeli army that was in the occupied east bank of the canal, the Sinai Peninsula. It was also fought along the Jordan River Valley, and some of it was fought in Syria and South Lebanon. It led to a lot of casualties. The numbers are hard to but I mean, hundreds and hundreds of Israeli soldiers, thousands of Arab soldiers, hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians, Fideiyin, are killed, and many others captured or wounded. The War of Attrition had two important results. What the Egyptians basically did was to bring artillery up to the canal and try and bombard Israeli positions on the east bank so that they could cross. That's the whole business. From 1968, when they start this, up until actually the 73 war, that's the Egyptian strategy. We bombard enough that we can cross, and then we liberate Sinai, and we've achieved what we want to do. The Egyptian problem, of course, is that Israel has air superiority. And they can bomb the living bejesus out of the Egyptian artillery, Egyptian infantry, and so on and so forth on the west bank of the canal. What does that mean? You have to bring in anti-aircraft, or you have to develop air capabilities. The Egyptian Air Force continued to be inferior to the Israeli Air Force, especially because from 1968, the Israelis were getting the most powerful warplane on Earth, which was the Phantom, F-4 Phantom. Contract is signed in 68. The first Phantoms arrive in 69. They start shooting. The Mirages that they were using were doing a good job, but the Phantoms were much better. And from that point on, Israel has absolute air superiority, but slowly but surely, the Egyptians begin to shoot down Phantoms. In one 6-month period between the December of 1969, 8-month period, and early August, they shot down 6 or 7 Phantoms. That was more than the United States was capable of resupplying Israel with, because they needed the plane for Vietnam. The Air Force, the Marines, and the Navy all used the Phantom. And the Vietnamese were shooting them down at the same time. And production was limited. I mean, they were producing them as fast as they could, but they couldn't send the Israelis another dozen. Here's another dozen. We don't have another dozen, they said to them. And so what the Egyptians managed to do was to inflict unsustainable losses on the Israeli Air Force. 6 Phantoms, a bunch of other aircraft, in several months, when the United States simply couldn't resupply them, while pushing their anti-aircraft closer and closer to the Suez Canal, such that its range included the east bank of the Suez Canal. Think about that. If you have anti-aircraft weapons that have a range over your enemy's fortifications, then the enemy's air force can't protect those fortifications, and you can cross the canal, which in fact is what the Egyptian army did in 1973. So what the Egyptians managed to do was to push forward their anti-aircraft missiles to the canal, making possible the crossings that later took place during the October War. And they did this, by the way, in violation of a ceasefire that U.S. Secretary of State Rogers had imposed. It was supposed to be a in-place ceasefire. The Egyptians snuck their missiles up to the Suez Canal immediately afterwards, and the ceasefire held nevertheless. That's the first important result of this war of attrition. The second was Egypt and Jordan, as part of the Rogers Plan, for a ceasefire on the Suez Canal lines and supposedly between Jordan and the Jordanian frontier with Israel, both accepted Security Council Resolution 242. This is very important. This is the first Arab governments which in effect say, yes, we recognize Israel, we recognize its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, we recognize we have to make peace with it. All of the passages that I read you from 242, the document is in your packet. You can go back and read it at your leisure. But understand what this means. It means the two leading Arab combatants are now declaring we are willing to settle this other than by force, A, and B, we're effectively we're willing to recognize Israel. Now this was a revolution. No Arab government had said anything like this since before 1948. None of them accepted. I mean, Abdullah would have accepted if he dared to, but he didn't publicly accept Israel. He negotiated with Israel, but he wouldn't publicly recognize it. Here they were saying they were willing to negotiate with it, recognize it, and have peaceful relations with it once the territorial issues were settled. Obviously, the Egyptians said, we want all of the Sinai back. They weren't willing to settle for anything less than the entirety of Sinai, but they were saying, in effect, if you give it back to us, yes, you can have peace, we don't care. Good. This was a revolution in the Arab world. From this point on, both of these countries, and later Syria, which accepted 242 in 1973, all three of the major competent countries with Israel were committed to end the war with Israel and to recognize its sovereignty and territorial integrity, that's the language of 242, and its right to secure and recognize boundaries. Obviously, this led to a conflict with the PLO, which at this point was talking about the liberation of everything. This, in turn, was complicated by the death immediately after the acceptance of the Rogers Plan of Abdel Nasser. He died of a heart attack saying goodbye to Arab dignitaries at Cairo airport. It was followed by the Jordanian army's crackdown on the Palestinians in Jordan, where they had set up a state within a state, provoking the Jordanians, challenging them, and using Jordan as a base for attacks on Israel. The Jordanian army, starting in September of 1970 and continuing into the spring of 1971, basically pushed the PLO out of Jordan. And it very soon after that led to the fall of the Neo-Ba'ath regime in Syria, to be replaced by Hafez al-Assad's regime, which had an entirely different view of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In a couple of years, Assad was to accept 242 himself, which the Neo-Ba'ath would never have done. So this is a really important period. It's a period which ends the PLO's having had the initiative in inter-Arab and Palestinian-Israeli affairs and Arab-Israeli affairs. From that point on, the Arab governments begin to take back the initiative. They begin to restrict PLO options and PLO operations. The defeat in Jordan, the defeat of the PLO in Jordan, was followed by a move by the Palestinians to Syria and to Jordan. The Syrian regime is quite hostile, unlike the regime, the Neo-Ba'ath folks who had been in power up until, when did he do the coup? November 1970. Hafez al-Assad was never a supporter of the Palestinians. Anybody who says he was doesn't know anything about Arab politics. They're ignorant, I'm sorry. This was a regime which from its initiation, from the moment it takes power, sees itself as absolutely committed to control everything that happens from Syria and in Syria, and as much as possible Arab politics, and tries to bring the PLO under its direct control, meaning it becomes an instrument of Syrian policy. And Syria's objective becomes very similar to the objective of Egypt, which is to retrieve its occupied territory, period, end of discussion. They don't care about anybody else's territory. Sadat comes to power in Egypt. That's his policy. That was Assad's policy. They did not differ one bit, except they were willing to betray each other. But leaving that aside, they essentially had the same objective, which was a nationalist, nation-state nationalist objective. I wrote an article, I don't know if I included it in your packet, where I talk about this actually goes back before the '67 war, but it becomes manifest in the years after the War of Attrition, after Black September, and so on. Now, following this period where the PLO loses the initiative and began to restrict the Palestinians, was also an important period in terms of other problems that the PLO now had to face. It was unable to operate from Jordan. It was highly restricted in Syria, only allowed to do the things that the Syrian regime wanted, which were very limited, and ended up mainly operating out of Lebanon, which was fine in one respect, because in Lebanon, as many Lebanese say, mafi dawli, there's no state. Okay? That's not entirely true, but it's one of the weakest of the Arab states, is now, was always, and looks like it may, unfortunately, continue to be. And in that situation, the Palestinians had an enormous amount of degree of freedom. In 1969, they had brokered a deal, or actually the Egyptians had brokered a deal, whereby they had almost complete freedom of movement, the so-called Cairo Agreement. And when they moved their operations to Beirut, they suddenly had the kind of freedom that they'd had briefly in Jordan from 1967 until 1970, but in a much weaker state, and with no military capable of putting them down, as the Jordanian army proved that it was capable of doing. Jordanian army was always created as an internal security force by the British back in the 20s. And it proved its worth in 1970-71. There was no such force in Lebanon. There was in Syria. The Syrian army, the Syrian mukhabarat, the Syrian security services had complete control over the Palestinians in Syria. That wasn't the case in Lebanon. But Lebanon was a country in which there were delicate sectarian and political balances, which had had a civil war in 1958, where the arrival of the Palestinians destabilized the country, tipped various balances in a variety of ways, and engendered eventually a great deal of hostility towards the Palestinians on the part of some sectors of the Lebanese population. And this was all going on at a time when, in 1974, 73, 74, Kissinger was extraordinarily active in beginning the process which ultimately leads to the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. People give President Carter the credit for that treaty. The credit really should go to Kissinger and Nixon and Ford. They lay the groundwork for what Carter ends up doing in 1978, 79 with the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. What does he do? He intervenes at the end of the October War, and he gets the Israelis eventually to stop. He lets them go on quite a ways. They cross the canal, they defeat the Egyptian army, they get down to within a few score of kilometers from Cairo. They can threaten Cairo. There's almost nothing between them and Cairo. He stops them. And he immediately launches a diplomatic process for a Geneva conference, which takes place with only a few participants, and for a disengagement agreement between Egypt and Israel. This is the beginning of the process that leads to the peace treaty of 79. This is 1974. And what is he doing here? He is separating Egypt from the Soviet Union. He's winning Egypt over into the American column. He brought the Soviets to Geneva, but effectively it was Kissinger who was calling the shots, as it was Baker who was calling the shots at Madrid in 1991. This was an American process. From this moment on, actually the Rogers Plan in 1970 was an American process. The Soviets were involved much more. But essentially Rogers. It's called the Rogers Plan. It's not named for the Soviet foreign minister. It's named for the American Secretary of State. And Kissinger continues this process and expands it enormously. Now, why does he do this? He does this because at the end of the October War, something had happened which scared people in Washington to death. And this is the fact that by giving the Israelis a chance to defeat the Egyptian army, humiliate the Egyptian army, cross the canal to the west side, and threaten Cairo, the Soviets were humiliated. And the Soviet Union wasn't going to take this. So the Soviet Union started preparing paratroop divisions to be sent to Egypt and started moving nuclear weapons. The United States replied by putting its nuclear arsenal on alert, DEFCON 3, whatever that is, DEFCON. It means, you're getting ready for nuclear war. So the United States and the Soviet Union were brought by this conflict in the Middle East to the brink of nuclear war. There are people more expert at this than I who say this was as severe, as serious, as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was much more dramatic. But it was dramatic. And so Kissinger realized, I have to defuse this. And I'm going to defuse it by forcing the Israelis to withdraw. In the first Sinai disengagement agreement of 74, in the Syrian-Israeli disengagement agreement of the same year, and in the second Sinai disengagement agreement of 1975, Kissinger forces Israel to go backwards. Okay? It gives up its gains of the 73 war in Egypt. It gives up almost a half of Sinai via the second Sinai disengagement agreement. It gives up the city of Quneitra to the Syrians as part of the Syrian-Israeli disengagement agreement. In all of these things, what he's doing is to serve American interests, which have to do with winning these countries over to the American column from the Soviet column. That is their obsession. Nixon, Ford, Kissinger. They're not doing this because they like the brown eyes of the Egyptians or the Syrians. They are doing it because they want to win the Cold War in the Middle East. And they do. Basically, the United States wins the Cold War in the Middle East. Sadat comes entirely into the American column. The Syrians are dealing with the Americans constantly, happily. This image of the Syrian regime, which the Israelis constantly propagate, is a false image. This was a regime that worked very well with the United States. And this is happening at a time when, even though the Egyptians and the Syrians are negotiating with the United States in the wake of the 73 war, the Soviet Union is slowly but surely retracting, withdrawing, losing its influence, losing its power in the Middle East. There's a backstory to this. The backstory to this is that the October War, which I am about to talk about in more detail, was launched not because Anwar al-Sadat wanted to go to war. The Egyptian army had prepared for the crossing of the canal and for the liberation of Sinai as part of the war of attrition back in 1968, 69, 70. But Sadat hoped that he could cut the deals that Kissinger later enabled him to cut in 74 and 75. As early as 1971, he sent emissaries to the Saudis and said, could you tell your American friends we are ready to make a separate peace with Israel? And King Faisal said, okay, I'm beginning to get some oil dollars. Saudi GDP went up 1,000% between 1970 and 77. Okay? This is the oil boom. This is the Arab oil boycott during the war, but it starts even before. Faisal was able to flex his muscles. And he went to the Americans and he said, yo, this guy wants to basically hand Egypt over to you. He's willing to make a separate peace with Israel. He's accepted 242. He wants to make a deal. Secretary of State Rogers was hot to trot. He thought, great idea. He goes to Kissinger and President Nixon. I don't know, not so much. Don't care. Busy with China, whatever it was. The United States was totally unresponsive. Finally, Egypt decides to go to war together with Syria. They launched the 73 war. We all know what happened. If you don't know, you can read about it somewhere else. I don't want to tell you the military details. And the end result is that Kissinger is forced to do in 1974-75 what he should have done in 70, 71, 72, which is to bring Egypt towards a separate peace with Israel. And that's really the genesis of what later on becomes the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Now, I talked already about Kissinger organizing the Geneva Conference. I've talked about how it brought Egypt into the American camp. And the fact that it really is, it means the United States wins the Cold War in the Middle East, as I said. I've talked about how it's a defeat from the Soviet Union and how it represents the complete monopolization of what comes to be called the peace process by the United States. And I want to say one more thing about this before I go back to the Palestinians, which I think is important. And this is what Kissinger did belatedly in 74, 75, and what Eisenhower did in 56, 57, is evidence that when larger American interests are seen as being at stake, economic interests, strategic interests, the United States is not particularly solicitous of Israel. Where things that relate to major states like Saudi Arabia or Egypt are in play, the United States occasionally will say, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're not going to do what the Israelis want. We don't care what the Israelis want. We will do what we want, and we will make them do what we want. And you have to read Kissinger's memoirs and read the diplomatic correspondence about the negotiations in 73, 4, and 5 to see the degree to which he twisted the Israelis' arms up behind their backs and very severely dislocating some arms in the process. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. And it is an illustration, and there are many other illustrations. Obama did the same thing with the JCPOA. Anytime, Reagan did the same thing with the sale of early warning airplanes, AWACS, to Saudi Arabia. Where vital American interests are concerned, whether economic or strategic, the United States will act in accordance with whatever the elites in Washington think are our interests. And whether that is consonant with what Israel wants or not is completely irrelevant where those kinds of interests are at stake. The tragedy for the Palestinians is that nothing relating to the Palestinians seems to be seen as an American national interest. Okay? Whereas things relating to Israel sometimes are, sometimes are not. But there is an assumption, whether it's because Israel is an ally during the Cold War or Israel is an ally during the so-called war on terror, that Israel has to be catered to, at least where things that don't concern vital American interests are concerned. Hence, American support for this war on Gaza. Up until Trump, for whatever reason, finally decided, no, there's an American interest in stopping it. Extremely belatedly, obviously. Okay, let's go back to the history. After all of these things happen, after the October War is fought, and lost and won and lost and won, after the disengagement agreements, the PLO faces a terrible dilemma. The Arab confrontation states, all of them, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, now all except 242. They all accept negotiations with Israel under American auspices. They all accept a peaceful settlement. The Arab-Israeli War ended in 1973. The war between the Arab states, which starts in 48, ends in 73. Ends. What you have now are some occupied Arab territories to be liberated by negotiation, the Golan Heights, the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. But the Arab states are no longer at war with Israel. The Syrians fight briefly with Israel in 1982, and they agree to a ceasefire within a couple weeks. But that's the only time an Arab country was actually engaged in war with Israel after 1973. And the Palestinians are basically left on their own. The Arab governments are committed only to liberating their own occupied territories, and each of them is scheming to achieve a separate peace at the expense of the others. Sadat, in fact, tells Palestinian leaders in 1974, and they told people I was sitting with when they came back from Cairo, they asked, but you're going to go ahead without the Syrians. He said, these guys say that Sadat said, look at what they've done to us in the past. Why should we worry about the Syrians? We'll do what's in our national interest, or words to that effect. And I'm sure the Syrians were saying the same thing about the Egyptians at that time. The Palestinian resistance movement had advocated the liberation of all of Palestine. It had advocated a secular democratic state for everybody, Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Muslims, and so on. Now, it was clear that the Arab states were ready for peace and would not support such a program. What this leads to is really a very important set of changes. It leads to a complete rethinking, especially on the part of the Fatah leadership, of what they can and cannot do. And they basically abandon the old liberation program. They never admit it, at least not for 15 years or 14 years. But basically, they are ditching the program of complete liberation. You first detect this, if you know how to read political statements, in the so-called provisional program adopted by the Palestine National Congress in 1974, which calls for a sulta wataniya muqatila, a fighting national authority in any part of Palestine to be liberated. Translation, a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Now, they don't say that. Palestinian state alongside Israel is not in the document. Alongside Israel is not in the document. Fighting is still in the document. Sulta watani muqatila implies we will liberate it ourselves with the skin of our teeth. That's not what's meant. What is meant is they are moving over to a two-state solution. What it means is that they are moving over to acceptance of Israel. What it means is they're moving over to acceptance of the idea of partition. Okay, and the debate is the debates that go on in the Palestine National Congress for the Council, Majlis, Council, Congress, whatever. You can translate it as you choose. Are fierce from that point on, because a lot of people within Fatah and in the PFLP and other groups are saying, "Wait a minute, what happened to our program of a single democratic state? What happened to the idea of liberation of everything? If we're just going to liberate some of it, basically we're accepting a whole bunch of things that the Arab governments have accepted, but which leave us out in the cold." And the problem, of course, was the PLO was entirely dependent in some measure on these Arab governments because it was under attack in Lebanon at that time. And that's a key part of this. The war in Lebanon, which starts with the Lebanese army attacking the camps in 73, continues in 75, 76 with a ferocious war between right-wing Lebanese forces and the PLO and left-wing Lebanese forces, and continues in some form until 1990. But the Palestinian part of it ends with the expulsion of the PLO in 82. The war in Lebanon is partly a Lebanese civil war, but it's partly a proxy war. And it's partly a war directed at weakening the PLO. And again, the fingers of Henry Kissinger can be seen. The fingers of several Arab regimes can be seen. The military might of Israel, and also for that matter of Syria, can be seen. Both operate against the PLO in Lebanon. Syrian army is fighting the PLO in 1976 and 77. My mother is wounded by a Syrian checkpoint right near our house in 1977 as there's fighting going on near Sabra and Shatila. Our house is in West Beirut. But the Syrian army has occupied West Beirut in the guise of the Arab deterrent forces. And they're fighting the PLO. They had fought them from the summer of 1976 and will continue to fight them into 77. At the same time, the Israelis are fighting them. And the right-wing Lebanese militias are fighting. And behind all of this is our boy Henry Kissinger. Now, he's not manipulating and controlling it. Each of these actors has their own interests. Israel, we can guess. Syria, they want to control Lebanon and the PLO. And they enter into an alliance with, of all people, the phalangists, the liberals, the Lebanese forces, the right-wing militias, in order to weaken and dominate the PLO. So the PLO is in a vise. It's in a very difficult situation. At the time these deliberations are taking place. It's one thing to say, we want to liberate all of it, and another thing to say, and with whom? Given that you're standing on ground which is contested, you've been driven out of Jordan, and the Arab regimes are basically ready to make peace with Israel if they can get their pound of flesh, their piece of territory, whatever you want to call it. It was a series of decisions made over multiple Palestine National Congresses until you get to the meeting in Algiers in 1988, where the PLO basically issues in its declaration of independence an explicit acceptance of the principle of partition, an explicit acceptance of 242, an explicit acceptance of a peaceful resolution, and an explicit acceptance of Israel. The Israelis never admit that the PLO has recognized them. They keep saying, you have to recognize us again. I think the PLO recognized Israel 3 times, and they still don't think they have. But anyway, that's another issue. Okay, I would argue that all of this is driven by the results of the 73 war. That's why I've given it so much importance. Given that the United States was the sole dishonest broker now for the whole process, that meant that meeting American conditions to gain admission to the peace process became one of the main aims of Palestinian diplomacy for the next decade plus. At a time when the PLO is engaged in fighting on all of these fronts. It was obviously not an easy thing to do. Okay, I've gone over with part number 3. Let me finish with number 4. I think I can do this quickly. We have gone from the 40s to the 80s, the 1940s to the 1980s in one session. And I want to talk now about the 1982 war. The 1982 war was the brainchild of a government headed by a man by the name of Menachem Begin, who was the head of the Likud party. And the planning was done by his Secretary of Defense. We would say Minister of War. I think that's more appropriate. Ariel Sharon. Begin had just come to power in 1977 in an election which turfed the Labour Party out of power for the first time since it came to control the Jewish agency back in the 20s. The Mapai party becomes the Labour Party. Begin's party, called Likud, was the successor to Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionists. And it was clearly committed. This is the party which has dominated Israeli politics since 1977. Most prime ministers of Israel, from Begin onwards, Shamir, Netanyahu, you know their names, or you might know their names, and Sharon, several others, Ehud Olmert, are Likud. There were periods of coalition governments, but most of the governments since 1977 have either been Likud governments or have been dominated by Likud in coalitions. The Likud party was committed to the ideology of the greater land of Israel. In Jabotinsky's time, that meant everything, including the east bank of the Jordan. If you look at the old revisionist, posters, they have two rifles and both banks of the Jordan. What's today west of the Jordan, Israel, Palestine, east of the Jordan, what's today Jordan. But they were deeply committed to this. The 1977 Likud party platform, which is still the guiding light of Likud policies, says in its preamble, and I'm going to quote now. This is the Likud party platform on which they were elected in 1977. The right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is eternal and indispensable, and is linked to the right to security and peace. Judea and Samaria will not be handed to any foreign administration. Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. So the river to the sea is not a Palestinian slogan originally. It is the Likud party platform. It's not just a slogan that some young people may shout on Madison Avenue. It is the slogan of the party that has governed Israel for most of the period since 1977. It is the guiding light of the ideology of this party. They passed a nation-state law in 2018, which enshrines this very principle. Only the Jewish people have the right of self-determination. And that's a constitutional law passed in, we'll come to it later, which shows that this is not just something they said in 1977 didn't mean. This is the core ideology of the Likud party. And there are a half dozen parties to their far right, which are considerably more extreme. This is the most moderate version of this ideology. So those are the people who decided to go to war in 1982. And they did this because things did not seem to be going their way in the period before and after 1977, before and after they came to power. There had been various attempts to weaken and defeat the PLO in Lebanon. They weren't going so well. The Syrians intervened. Israel invaded in 1978. Didn't really seem to weaken them. The elections that were held for the mayoralties in the West Bank returned majorities for PLO-supported candidates. That wasn't very good. If you consider that Judea and Samaria will not be handed to any foreign administration and all the mayors are pro-PLO, you've got a problem. And so, in spite of all of these, because of all of these things, Sharon and Begin decided that a much more extensive operation than the one that they launched in 1978 and which had gone up to the Litani River in South Lebanon was necessary. And after clashes in 1981 resulted in a U.S. negotiated truce that left the PLO in a very strong position, the decision was taken. We're going to go in and we're going to go much farther than we went in 1978. In 1978, they tried to set up a puppet militia, what became the South Lebanese Army of Lebanese that they recruited to fight for them. Again, go back to the British counterinsurgency manual. You don't do the dirtiest fighting yourself. You get other natives to fight for you. That's what the South Lebanese Army was. That's what the militias that the media is misreporting are fighting with the Hamas security forces. These are Israeli, organized, armed, trained, financed gangs, which are, again, Wingate, Caldwell, Teagard, the guys who I've been mentioning, were the ones who taught them to do this. This is not an Israeli invention. They've invented many things, but they didn't invent this. And so they had set up this militia. It did not help. It didn't stop the Palestinians. And so this time, Sharon himself went to Washington to get a green light from the American government. He met with Secretary of State Haig. All of this is in the 100 Years' War, if you want the details. The Reagan administration, you may remember, was vigorously anti-Soviet. This was the evil empire, is what Reagan had called the Soviet Union. And the Reagan administration, Haig, personally approved of Sharon's plans. These were to defeat the PLO, remove it, end Syrian influence in Lebanon, install a government that would be willing to make peace on Israeli terms. Haig signs off on all of this. So as in 1967, this was not an isolated decision made by Israel independently. It was an American-approved joint operation in which Haig explicitly said that U.S. weapons were to be used offensively. Now, using American weapons offensively is a clear violation of U.S. law, the Leahy Law and other laws, which mandate that U.S. supplied weapons can only be used for defensive purposes. And there's other aspects to it, in no way that would harm people's human rights. Technically, any U.S. official who allows U.S. weapons to be used in violation of these laws is himself or herself breaking the law. This is why they will not stop talking about self-defense. Israel is engaged in self-defense. It killed 4,000 people, 15,000, 80,000 in self-defense, meaning it's not illegal. They're protecting themselves. They have to say that. Otherwise, they're criminals in terms of U.S. law. Not that a lot of people these days seem to care about the law, but anyway, that's another issue. The outcome of the war, which started early in June of 1982, was much as you would have expected, given the multi-division size of the Israeli invasion force, given their complete control of the air and the sea. Syrian troops fought for a couple of weeks and retreated from the Bekaa Valley and accepted a ceasefire. And at that point, the PLO and its Lebanese allies were alone in the field. There was resistance in Saida. There was some resistance in the mountains. There were strong resistance on the approaches to Beirut. But eventually, PLO forces were besieged in Beirut with their allies. The siege went on from sometime in June until August 11th. The American envoy was a man named Ambassador Philip Habib. He's a distinguished American diplomat. I happened to know him because when he was stationed in Korea, my father was stationed in Korea, and my parents used to play bridge with him and his wife. I think her name was Phyllis. I don't know why I remember that. So I knew him, and later on I interviewed him for a book, for the Under Siege book. He said a lot of interesting things. You can read about it in Under Siege, if you're really, really interested. Anyway, Habib was not really a mediator. He did what, again, Aaron David Miller said. Mediators, American mediators always did. He acted as a lawyer for Israel, pressuring the PLO to withdraw from Beirut under the bombing and the shelling that Israel was administering. Nothing compared to what they did to Gaza, but pretty devastating. Between 17 and 19,000 people are killed as a result. The PLO resisted until it realized that Beirut's population, which up until this point had been supportive of the Palestinian cause, got fed up. And Lebanese leaders, Shafiq Wazan, the prime minister, Saeb Salam, the former prime minister, others went to the PLO and said, look, we like you guys, you're good, whatever, but we just don't want the city to be destroyed. And they had chewed up the southern suburbs, and they were advancing, or trying to advance. And it was pretty clear that they would flatten the city if the PLO didn't evacuate. So the American intermediaries, the American mediators didn't deal directly with the PLO. They talked to Prime Minister Wazan, to Saeb Salam, to other Lebanese government officials or former officials, and they talked to the Palestinians. So it was an indirect negotiation, pretty much like we saw in Qatar and in Egypt, where the Israelis would talk to somebody who would then talk to Hamas. The irony of it is that the United States had, again, Henry Kissinger is to thank for this, in 1975, promised Israel that it would not talk to the PLO until it met a bunch of conditions. And the United States was faithful to this as far as this negotiation was concerned. But we have since learned that American diplomats were actually secretly talking to the PLO because the PLO provided security for the U.S. Embassy in Beirut until 1982. There were no attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Beirut until 1982. After 1982, it was attacked 3 times. And the negotiations did include political matters in blatant violation of the solemn commitment that Kissinger had made to the Israelis in 1975, which shows that the United States can be two-faced with many parties, not just with the Palestinians. The PLO finally decided to withdraw, but it demanded that the United States give guarantees for the safety of the Palestinian civilian population that would be left behind when the fighters who had, held up the Israelis from entering Beirut for 2 months were evacuated. The United States gave those guarantees. The United States promised that no harm would come to civilians, promised the safety of the camps. I've seen the original documents published on them. I've talked to the American diplomats who wrote them. It's all in the Under Siege book if you're interested. After the PLO left at the end of August, beginning of September, a new president was elected. Many of the members, the parliament elects the president in Lebanon. And many of the members of parliament were kindly driven to parliament by Israeli armored vehicles, showing the complete independence of the election. And that was a man by the name of Bashir Ismail. A couple weeks later, he was assassinated, not by a Palestinian, as it happens, by somebody probably working for the Syrians. And Israeli troops immediately violated their agreements with the Americans, entered West Beirut, surrounded the refugee camps, sent their Lebanese right-wing allies into the camps to carry out the Sabra and Shatila massacre. This was not a one-off. We have massive documentation about discussions between Israeli military and intelligence people with the Lebanese forces people, Bashir Ismail and all of his subordinates, about such massacres. At one point they say, we're going to turn Sabra and Shatila into a parking lot. No, we're going to turn it into a zoo. They were going to destroy the camp. They were going to kill the people. And they had meanwhile been killing people all over Lebanon. In areas that were occupied by the Israeli army, the phalangists and their allies in the Lebanese forces were setting up checkpoints, and they were kidnapping and killing Druze, Shia, Sunnis, Palestinians, whoever struck their fancy as somebody they should kill. This is something that had been happening during the Civil War, but it rose to a level, much higher level, under the Israeli occupation in the parts of South Lebanon and the mountains, where the Lebanese forces were given a free rein, and they were given entry into, if you ever see the movie, it's an animated film, I think. What's it? Waltz with Bashir. You can see the details. The guy who is the narrator was firing illumination shells to enable these guys to kill people. About 18,000 people were killed, most of them civilians. Most of them directly targeted in areas where there were no combatants. Tom Friedman, when he was still a journalist, was the bureau chief in Beirut and reported back to the New York Times that Israel was engaged in indiscriminate bombardments of West Beirut. And A.M. Rosenthal was, I think, the foreign editor of the New York Times at the time. And he removed the word indiscriminate. And Friedman, who at the time was still a journalist, sent the Times at the time, this is before the internet, this is before email, sent in, as part of their internal system a message saying, I know that they're indiscriminate. I'm telling you, the place that I'm staying has nobody armed anywhere near it for like a mile, and they're bombarding the living hell out of it. But the Times didn't change it, of course. And so Friedman, to his credit, released all of this internal documentation to a something that I don't think exists anymore, the Village Voice. If you look it up, you can see the whole back and forth between Friedman and his editors. Of course it was indiscriminate. Of course they killed civilians, intentionally. Of course. Tom Friedman said it. It must be true. And it's been true ever since the British taught them to do this in 1936-39. And that's what we've been seeing in Gaza. The result of the war, the PLO was forced into exile. This very much weakened its linkage to the Palestinian populations of Lebanon and Syria, which had been its base. This weakened it in terms of its relationships with the Arab states. the PLO was sent to a bunch of Arab countries. Some went to Yemen, some went to Algeria, some went to Sudan, some went to Tunis, some went to Egypt, some went, and so on, some went to Syria. And these groupings became the playthings of these regimes. The ones in Syria launched a rebellion against Arafat, backed by the Syrian regime. In other places, the governments tried to suborn them in Iraq and so on and so forth. So the PLO became more dependent on the Arab governments than it had ever been, whether it was based in Jordan and was semi-independent or was based in Lebanon and was semi-independent. And then in 1990, to leap ahead in time, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. And the PLO made a crucial strategic error in supporting Saddam against the wishes of almost the entire Arab world. And at that point, the PLO completely lost its political support in the Arab world. The Arab government said, you support the Iraqis in invading a sovereign Arab country? And as far as the Gulf countries are concerned, this was a sacrilege. I mean, they felt the same way when Qatar was attacked, by the way. They have a particular feeling about this, and understandably. And they were outraged, and the PLO lost support that it never regained, weakening it such that when the Madrid peace process came around, which I'll talk about next week, they were in no position to say no. They had completely burned their bridges with most Arab governments by supporting Saddam in response to public opinion which said, oh, the Iraqis are going to win, whereas anybody with a brain to see or with a brain could tell that Iraq was going to be destroyed. Which is what happened very soon afterwards. And the PLO was in an extremely powerless position, much worse than it had been when it left Beirut in '82. This really put the seal on its weakness and made it possible for what happened thereafter, and we'll be talking about that next week, to happen. Done. I thought I would go for an hour and a half. I went for 2 full hours.
I mean, I don't think I've seen someone cover 40 years of history so flawlessly, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. We have about a little under 5 minutes, maybe actually 4 minutes. Do you want to take maybe a quick round of questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's take 3 or 4, and I'll answer them as best I can. And if anybody needs to leave or wants to leave, go ahead.
Awesome. All right, Ibtihal is running the mic, so if you just raise your hands, let's start this side. I'll do 2 from here.
2 from here, 2 from there.
Yeah, wait, Hiba, can we grab a mic real quick?
Yeah, you need a mic. I'm sorry I went on so long. I couldn't help it. My notes were less extensive, but they went longer.
Thank you, Rashid. I was wondering if you could talk about your interpretation of the transactional nature of American foreign policy in this period of time after the October War. In other words, the recycling of the petrodollars into the economy. And what happened yesterday with the transactional nature of the Trump family benefiting. Jared Kushner gets $1.5 billion from Qatar, or excuse me, from the UAE, et cetera, and the $2 billion, the UAE gets $2 billion to the Trump family for the cyber. You know what I'm talking about.
I got it.
So what are the similarities and dissimilarities?
Okay, one more question from this side, and then we'll take 2 from that side.
One on the other side?
On the other side of the column there. Keeps bumping the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the motivation behind the new Syrian regime to adopt Resolution 242, and also why, in your opinion, there is confusion now around why that regime supported Palestine when it was, in fact, the opposite, or was like a big supporter of Palestine.
Yeah, good question. Couple from this side.
Let's do this one on the right side, and then we'll do one in the middle back.
Thank you, Professor. Very quick question. Where does Iran fit into this scheme in the 60s and 70s, and then obviously after the revolution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one more.
Thank you for your time. I just wanted to ask about this emerging new bourgeoisie that you talked about earlier on in the lecture. What we know about nations that are struggling for their liberation from imperialist powers is that the bourgeoisie can be divided generally up into a national bourgeoisie that has some interest in their own nation's liberation, albeit maybe just to exploit their own working class, and then the other bourgeoisie, which can be described as a comprador bourgeoisie
Right.
that acts as a puppet for these imperialists. What was the orientation to the bourgeoisie
Right.
by the
Good question.
PLO, by the PLFLP as well?
Gotcha. Okay, I'll take them from the bottom. I mean, I think that that's a rough and ready analytic frame, but it has some truth to it. I mean, you have elements of the bourgeoisie in the Arab world generally, and in the Palestinian case in particular, which I think can be described as a national bourgeoisie, in that they are deeply committed to the Palestine cause. They funded all of these organizations. They were not funded, they got some support from Arab governments, they got some support from China or the Soviet Union or whatever, but essentially the funding for them comes from these contractors and these bankers and so on and so forth, in Kuwait, in Amman, in wherever it may be. And I think you'd have to call that national bourgeoisie. Now, at the same time, you have people whose interests are tied either to the Arab regimes or to international capitalism. I mean, somebody I know is the agent for Coca-Cola in the West Bank. I mean, he is also a big, donor to various things. So he may be both. I think it's an overly schematic, breakdown. But there certainly is the latter group. There's no question. You have people who are really eager to make concessions to Israel so that they can do business, so that they can continue to prosper. And I think that class has changed and matured over time. And I think that there are still elements that you'd have to describe as national, but there are very important elements that I think you'd have to analyze, whether you call them comprador or you call them as, very much aligned with international global capitalism. Doesn't matter. So yeah, I think we have both of those now. Where does Iran fit in? In the 60s and until the revolution, the Iranian regime was a big supporter of Israel. And a big supporter, for example, during the wars in Lebanon, of, in particular, of one group within what became the Lebanese forces. I remember once where we were living in West Beirut, this might have been in '75, 2 mortar shells landed. And later on when we went to see the damage, at the bottom of a mortar, there's what looks like a shotgun shell. It's what I don't know how to describe it. Anyway, one of them had the crossed swords and palm tree of the Saudi National Arsenal, which means the Saudis had sent those to the Phalangists, and one was produced in the Iranian National Arsenal. So those are both countries that were supporting the right-wing Lebanese militias against the PLO and the Lebanese forces, Lebanese national movement in the 70s. So Iran supporting Israel and the opponents of the PLO. After the revolution, the PLO was very, very happy with the Iranian revolution at the outset. They expected it would change the balance of forces in the region. Iran became supportive of the Palestinians. But I would argue, as with all supporters of the Palestinians or opponents of the Palestinians, they were operating in terms of their national interests as they saw them. And that sometimes coincided with Palestinian aims, and sometimes it didn't. And I would argue that what you saw happen during this war of the last 2 years shows that Iranian support, for example, for Hezbollah, was essentially directed not so much as supporting the Palestinians as to protect Hezbollah's position in Lebanon and to serve as a deterrent against Israel attacking Iran. If you look at Hezbollah's capabilities, they were essentially a huge arsenal of rockets meant to prevent the Israelis from attacking either Lebanon or Iran. Which is what a deterrent is supposed to do. It is not, if you use it, the deterrence has failed. Deterrence means you deter. I deter you by doing something that prevents you from doing what you would otherwise have done. That's what that arsenal was created to do. It did not involve an offensive capability for crossing the border. The Israelis were hysterical about the possibility that Hezbollah was digging tunnels and was about to invade Galilee. Could not, did not, were not going to, was not in their intention, and it was not what they were created for. They were not created to be an offensive force against Israel. They were created to have enormous deterrent capacity such that they would prevent or help to prevent Israel from attacking Iran, period. So you can see the element in the sense in which that was helpful to Hezbollah or to Lebanon or to the Palestinians, and you can see the sense in which it wasn't. So I would argue that pretty much sums up Iranian and the foreign policy of every other country. Anybody who thinks that countries do things purely or solely for ideological reasons should look very, very carefully to see the extent to which that's true. The Neo-Ba'ath acted out of ideological motives. They actually did. They were willing to sacrifice for the Palestinians. I don't love them particularly, but it has to be said that they did something that's quite unusual for a nation state. You can see the Soviet Union doing that at a few periods. And then you can see it. Socialism in one state is we do what serves the Soviet Union. If we sacrifice the French Communist Party or the Chinese Communist Party in order to do a deal with the Kuomintang or in order to do a deal with this or that French government, we will do it. Because it's in the national interest of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is the capital of communism, There's a justification for it. It's nation-state interest. And I would argue that's what motivates. Iran has powerful ideological motivations. It's not to say they don't exist under this regime. But it also is a nation-state that acts in its own interest. Why did Assad support 242? Hafez al-Assad came to power as a military man. He disapproved of the Neo-Ba'ath. He didn't believe in long-term People's War of Liberation. He didn't like the idea of people having arms. He wanted the army to have arms. He was the former Air Force commander. He was a regular army soldier. He did not believe in any of these theories. He did not believe in letting the Palestinians have their head. He did not believe that this would work. He figured, if we can fight them, we can cut a deal. And that's what he did in 73. He joined with the Egyptians. They fought the Israelis. They got a deal. He got back Quneitra. He didn't get back all of the things that the Egyptians got back, because the Israelis were much tougher in dealing with Syria than they were in dealing with Egypt, because Egypt was the big prize. And the Americans were more willing to force the Israelis to do things with Egypt, in terms of Egypt, because Egypt was the big prize for the United States. Syria is less important. So Kissinger tried to have a second disengagement, but not very hard with the Syrians. So he left them. But Assad thought he could get much more than he ended up getting. And that he had exactly the same motivation as Sadat did, with rhetoric that was militant, but with, in practical terms, very much the same willingness to cut a deal with Israel. And they came very close twice to deals with the Israelis. In the negotiations that I was a part of in Washington from 1991 to 1993, the head of the Israeli delegation to the Syrian-Israeli bilateral negotiations in Washington from January of 92 through 93 was Itamar Rabinovich, who is an expert on Syria. He's written books about Syria, which are actually not bad. And he has told me, and other sources have said the same thing, they were very, very close to a deal with the Syrians. I mean, they literally were separated by a few meters of mud on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee from a deal. And the Americans, to their eternal discredit, were unable to push it through. I mean, Kissinger would have done it. Baker was not there anymore. Baker had left, remember, to run Bush's failed second election campaign. And you had a bunch of incompetents in the Clinton White House, amateurs, two secretaries of state who were among the worst in American history, and a bunch of people. Again, when Baker was running the State Department, these people under him were fairly competent, even though, as Miller said, we were lawyers for Israel. When the cat was away, the mice played. And under the Clinton administration, they weren't able to bring it through. And there was, again, another opportunity a little later. So Assad was willing to do a deal. He just didn't get the deal done. Transactional nature of U.S. diplomacy. Well, I mean, we are talking today with this administration about something that is, in some respects, quite different. Because, I mean, personal diplomacy has always been part of the deal. You know, the quality of a Philip Habib or the quality of a Kissinger or of a Baker made a difference. And the quality of some of the presidents made a difference, of a Roosevelt or whatever, whether for good or for ill. This is something quite unusual. I think it has to be admitted. Because the degree to what is being put forward in terms of personal interests, as against raison d'etat, the reason of state, national interests, is quite unusual. I mean, I think there are people who have done things essentially for personal glory in American foreign policy, diplomacy, and in foreign diplomacy of other countries. And the idea that the president is lusting after a Nobel Peace Prize, frankly, it's not terribly unusual. I think Kissinger was lusting after a peace prize. I think others had that kind of personal ambition. But the degree to which it's linked to material interest is completely unprecedented. And the degree to which family plays a role is largely unprecedented. Now, you've had a little bit of nepotism here and there in the past, but the degree to which the family regimes of the Gulf and the family regime of the Trump administration are on exactly the same wavelength is remarkable. You know, those regimes have been the same since they were founded. They were always their family, they're absolute monarchies, with the family, in essence, owning the state. L'État, c'est moi. That's not unusual. And dealing with them involved dealing with that peculiar reality of a monarchy A and of an absolute monarchy B and of the specific nature of Arab monarchies. But that you should have somebody similar in the White House, this is unprecedented, unprecedented. And you just listen to the man talk. He was saying something, oh, she has all these, Miriam Adelson, she has billions in the bank. And it's like he's saying, this is a saint, this is a person to be worshipped. I mean, the tone is, those billions are the ultimate sign of worth. That's very unusual. That's very unusual. And that should be one of the driving forces in a relationship between this country and particularly the Gulf monarchies. It's unprecedented. I mean, when Roosevelt meets with Ibn Saud on a warship in the Great Bitter Lake in the spring of 1945, just before the man dies, he doesn't talk about, you know, his estates on the Hudson River Valley. He's not talking to Ibn Saud about camels or land or what. He's talking to him about the national interests of Saudi Arabia, the national interests of the United States. Ibn Saud's talking the same language. And it's a completely different relationship between rulers than what we have, especially with the Gulf. It's not true with Israel. It's not true with other Arab countries. It's particularly true with the Gulf, and it's unprecedented. I mean, it used to be the case in monarchies were dealing with monarchies. That was normal, you know. I would marry my daughter to you, and you have dowry, and it was about money and family connections. That's what European diplomacy was for centuries with monarchies. Supposedly, we're beyond that, but apparently not. Thank you. Good night.